what I really wanted to do in this next 15 minutes or so was really dive into three of the key themes that I saw in the report, and really talk about how you can take some of those things away right now and start to build operational functions and operational capabilities around them. So I have some really simple slides because I really want to just talk to you and would love to see and hear your questions over in the Slack channel or here on the Zoom Q&A as well. So one of the big results that I thought was really interesting was that trend of maturity. And I think I just saw that Thomas Hart put a fantastic comment over in the Slack discussion thread that you might feel like you have a good level of maturity today, but the threats are always evolving. And I think that's a really useful and really interesting way to think about things. So what are some of the things that you can do very, very quickly to really help organizations to build out that maturity that they want? And I think I'm going to break this into really a couple of different sections. This helps a lot with some of those staffing and skill problems that we're seeing as well. I think the first thing that we'll say there is, and you've heard it from a lot of the vendors today, there are lots of vendors out there that are able to help you with proactive threat hunting and response on your behalf. I think we saw about a quarter of organizations have essentially outsourced threat hunting today. I think one thing to really consider there is you don't need to think of that as a binary choice, especially if you're in that growing, that maturing stage where you do want to build out your own internal threat hunting practice. But hopefully one of the things that we want to do is get some more folks in at the junior level, get some entry level folks and really start to build them up. Using a vendor's threat hunting, threat response service is a great way to backfill your own capabilities. And you really get a chance to interact with those experts and learn some really important things from those experts. The second piece I would say there is data. Now, so far today, you've heard a lot about how having wide visibility into different data sets, specifically endpoint and network, is incredibly important. And I completely agree. Sophos is also an NDR vendor. We absolutely believe that bringing those sources together into a single data lake platform that's going to enable both the Sophos threat hunting service, but also our customers to be able to quickly move and quickly pivot around and find some of those results inside of those data sets. But we don't think those two sources are where it stops. We think there's absolutely more things that we need to consider that can really enrich and a SOC analyst's ability to understand all of the context around a particular series of events. You've heard a lot about cloud, and absolutely cloud data, cloud network telemetry is very important, but also is bringing in other data about cloud infrastructure, authentication logs, understanding, are there any anomalous logins? Are there any open holes? Are there any S3 buckets that are unencrypted that perhaps contain something that looks like sensitive data that should be encrypted? Bringing in that kind of data, I'd like to think of that as kind of cloud metadata. You're reporting on the state of your various different cloud infrastructures. That is as important to some cloud-based investigations as having telemetry from the host systems and telemetry from the network segment as well. But there's also, what other sources of data can we think about for end users? And there, we think bringing in other sources of telemetry, like identity, is really important. So being able to pull data from an organization's Active Directory or Azure AD or their identity provider, being able to bring all of that in and really give that SOC team a full understanding of the full pathway that attacks might take. The other big thing that we still see a lot of attacks start with today is email. So bringing in email data, of course, we get some of that from the endpoint, but having that out on the specific data related to email is also really useful from that contextual perspective. Second, I was actually a little surprised at the number of organizations, especially the slight skew to the smaller end of the market, who are using homegrown tools. And I think we've heard a lot this morning as well that there are some fantastic open source tools out there. But what's interesting is when you're using those kind of homegrown things, you really start to need to consider the integrations. How does that homegrown tooling, how is the best way to build those integrations in with what is hopefully a single data plane, that data lake or SIM context? So for Sophos, we absolutely believe that the automation is going to be critical as we look at the next few years of cybersecurity. One thing that I thought was quite interesting as well from the report was the quick cadence of organizations talking about reviewing their threat hunting methodology. And I know the initial representatives from SANS mentioned that perhaps once a month is a little too quick. I'm drawing some of my own conclusions from that, but what I wonder is organizations are actually reviewing their response playbooks, perhaps more on that kind of cadence. And that certainly makes sense. Again, automation plays very importantly here. One of the key things to consider is if a threat hunt or an incident response exercise has led to taking a series of actions, really thinking, is this a good situation that I could apply some automation to in the future? Do I have a high enough level of confidence that if I've seen this series of events that I can automatically take some steps? One of the things you might want to consider there is building in immediate verification from an authorized individual. For instance, you may say, if we have telemetry across the network and the endpoint that gives us a very strong signal that a system is about to be attacked by some ransomware, we've seen something that's compelling command and control activity, we've seen some compelling data exfiltration activity that so far hasn't been proactively blocked, you may want to carry out some tasks on that. You may want to kill some processes or isolate that machine from the rest of the network. But human beings need to bring in some context there. What if it's a critical business application that you want to terminate a process of? In that moment, you might want to have a mechanism to have an authorization go out to an administrator or multiple administrator cell phones with that level of telemetry and context. So these series of detections have been observed. This is the other context about the host. If it's an endpoint, who the user is right now, in this moment, we have a series of response actions that we could take, which with the context that you as a security analyst have is the most important, the most useful one to take at that time. So strongly believe that automation is key. And I would definitely recommend regularly reviewing those playbooks. I think once a month sounds quite good for playbook review. One of the key things to track there is whether it's been used since. It's kind of, it's a lot like when you have a firewall rule and it tells you, since you implemented this policy, it's processed 0 kilobytes of traffic. So we either don't need that rule or we've malformed the rule and it's not blocking or allowing the traffic we're expecting. Definitely worth reviewing that kind of data for the for any automations and playbooks that have been generated. And then third, I absolutely loved that so many organizations are measuring the success of their threat hunting activities. I really believe that that's a critical piece as well. And I think we've seen some questions in the Slack room there about where do you start? How do you start to define that? I think MITRE is a good place. What MITRE lets you do, and you heard one of my other colleagues talk about it, is it gives you a common vernacular. It gives you a common way of talking about things. So perhaps one of those metrics you could use is the percentage of detections at each part through that MITRE chain. And obviously the goal there is to shift left, is to bring as many of those things towards early capture and early detection as possible. I also share some skepticism about, I describe myself as an IOC skeptic as well. I really do believe that threat intel is a very useful resource, but the nature of it, and I think it was Jamie who mentioned that perfectly, you have to start from a very specific place. I'd also go one step further, which is to say, the vast majority of initial intel or IOC triage is something that should also be automated. Think through what are the next steps. If there is a detection for the presence of a particular hash of a file or a connection to a network resource, think through what would the analyst want to do next. Perhaps if it's a network connection, they're going to want some process telemetry about what generated that traffic. If it's a process itself, they might want some context and a process tree to understand. All of that can be dealt with by automation, doing those searches, carrying out those enrichments, so that what we're delivering to analysts is high quality signals and immediately actionable intelligence. One thing that I think is really interesting as well was that lack of crossover of different threat intel sources. One key thing to build in your automations there as well is to look at the vendor that you're using for proactive protection on the endpoint. Ask that vendor, in Sophos, we call our API for this Intelix. Part of that triage and part of that context is also useful to know, what does my vendor think of this threat? If I'm searching for IOCs and my vendor already has that as something that would be proactively blocked, then it's still useful information to understand if it has been seen anywhere, but knowing when it started being proactively blocked will help you adjust how quickly and what the priority of that particular investigation might need to be. The last point I'll make is to talk about threat hunting concepts, and that the phrase hypothesis-based hunting. We use the term leadless hunting at Sophos, and those are the most important types of threat hunts. So I definitely encourage all the organizations I speak to spend a lot less time thinking of threat hunting as searching for IOCs and responding potentially to those, but actually using the hypothesis-based process. And I'd love to give you a really quick example of something that you can do. If we think back to the log4j vulnerability, which is on a real slow roll, what are some things that you can proactively do? Well, one of the key things there to understand is it could be anything that processes Java. So perhaps one of the things that we can do first is go and identify where are all of the Java renderers, all the Java processors out in our environment. We can run generic searches to look for Java executing, to look for Tomcat executing, and any of those other applications. That'll start to help us find jar files, find the actual applications. Because one of the interesting things with log4j was you weren't necessarily just able to search for those vulnerable jar files. They can be embedded into other applications. So starting with some of that proactive discovery and then moving on to what are the signals of a potential attack? It's that processing, that application, Java or Tomcat, launching other processes. Well, now I've verified where all of my Java is. I can start to look at those jar files, but I can also carry out proactive checks on if I'm seeing any of those signals. So I hope that was useful. Thank you so much for joining the session. Thanks to all of my colleagues.